This is Dave Heckeroth, and you've joined another round of Zilker Tech Talk. Today, we're going to be talking about managing rule conflicts when changing business decisions. We're going to do this with IBM's ODM product, and we'll talk about a number of things today. Here's our agenda. We're going to review a number of change management patterns. We're going to review the business decision that we're going to be using as an example to managing that conflict. We're going to go through a couple of change requests that have been set up in two different releases, and we're going to attempt to merge those two releases together and identify any conflicts. When we find the conflicts, we're going to determine the path for resolving those conflicts. Then ultimately, we'll deploy those to our dev environment and test those. Let's start by reviewing the change management patterns. Many of the changes that we're going to make to decision services, whether it be ODM or any other decision management tool, really fall into one of three major patterns. I guess there can be other deviations of this, but typically these are the major patterns that we see. The first one is a serial release pattern, and that's where release 1 starts, release 1 gets deployed, then release 2 gets created from the end of release 1's material. It goes for a period of time, then gets deployed, then release 3 starts from where release 2 left off, so on and so on. It's a relatively low complex pattern simply because there generically are no conflicts that are going to exist. All of the things that have been delivered previously are those things that make up the new release. Now with pattern number 2, this is an emergency fix release pattern, and this happens when a particular release gets started, a whole series of changes associated with that release, and then unbeknownst to release 1, a new release has to come in and receive changes and apply those changes all before release 1 finishes. So release 2 starts sometime in the middle of release 1 and ends prior to the end of release 1. And this pattern is characterized by the emergency fix release. This is of a medium complexity. And then lastly, we have the overlapping release pattern. And this is a scenario where you start a release. Before the end of that first release, you start a second release and maybe even a third release, all of which are based on information at this very point 0 time. And then there's going to be some resolving and some potential conflict that happens in here simply because release 1 will then be deployed and release 2 will have to consider those items in release 1 before release 2 goes to production. And we'll see how adding all three of these scenarios tends to make this our highest complexity pattern. Now let's just take a closer look at each of these patterns and make sure that we understand it. The serial release pattern, relatively simple, low complexity. From a release 1 standpoint, we create the release and we base it on the initial decision service at point 0 time. And then we create updated activities, all associated with release 1, various change requests, complete those from a testing perspective, and then ultimately step 3, we deploy that release to our rule execution server, and then we're ready to start release 2. We create release 2 based on the ending values and end of state of release 1. So we're starting where one left off, the other begins. We create a whole series of change activities, validation activities, and we update all those activities associated with release 2. Then we deploy that to the rule execution server, and then we can see that we can start release 3 directly from the information based on release 2, which is really a combination of release 1 and release 2 changes, and then we start the release 3 information activity changes, create and deploy those changes to the rule execution server, and we find that there's really no merging that has to happen. It's just in the setup of the individual releases, we need to make sure that we base it on the ending state of the prior release. So no real conflicts exist in this pattern. Now when we talk about the emergency fix pattern, it's the whole idea where you've started a release at point time 0 and you've done a certain amount of development of that release when you discover that you've got a new set of changes that have to go into production perhaps, and they have to start somewhere in the middle of release 1, and they're going to finish before the end of release 1. So they'll be based on time 0, and then they'll get deployed, and release 1 will have to incorporate those changes into itself. So there is a potential for conflict because release 2 and release 1 can have some overlapping rules. And it's a medium complexity because you're really only dealing with 2 releases, but let's kind of go through the steps. So from a release 1 perspective, we create the release, we build all the change activities and verification activities the same way we would do with just a serial release, but then we have an interruption. We go to the release 2 tasks, which simply say that we create release 2 based on the initial release, create all of the change activities associated with release 2, and then deploy release 2 to the rule execution server. So in that respect, release 2 almost takes the place of release 1, and then you go back to release 1 where release 2 exists, release 1 exists, you complete the changes to release 1. You know that you have to take the release 2 changes and incorporate them into release 1, so you have this compare process where you review the differences and you're going to merge anything from change 2 into change 1 so that you can then deploy change 1 at the end of the process. And then this third pattern is relatively high complexity simply because you can have 3 releases in play, and it really is a step-by-step process. So the first thing I like to do is consider just the first 2, consider what happens with them, and then incorporate any changes related to release 3. So let's review those steps. Release 1. We create the release for release 1, and then it's based on the initial release, as is all these releases. Then we create any change activities, verification activities, and deploy release 1 to the rule execution server as if nothing changed. And that's a no-cost release. There's not going to be any conflicts. The potential conflicts come in release 2, where release 2 has started from the initial 0.0 decision service, and it hasn't taken into account yet any changes with respect to release 1. You've got all the activity with release 2 that's happening, but before it can deploy, it has to then incorporate any changes associated to release 1. And that's what these steps 4 through 9 are. Create and update the initial change 2 releases. Now you're comparing release 1 and release 2 to understand what from release 1 needs to go into release 2, understanding that there's a potential merge process, resolving of conflicts and things of that nature. And then ultimately, when you do merge all these rule changes together, then you can deploy release 2 to the rule execution server and be confident that you have everything you need. Now, another layer of complexity comes in when you're considering step 3. You've got a deployed rule set number 2, and you're then being asked to incorporate some new changes. Notice that this release 3 starts before the end of either of these 2, so it's based on the initial decision service as well. And so you go through these same steps, but between release 3 and the updated version of release 2, which incorporates release 1 and 2, and then you resolve 3 that same way. Now that we understand the various patterns that can come into play when doing decision management updates, let's actually take a business decision that we're going to be changing and kind of walk through this process to give a little more visibility to what we've been talking to. For this rule conflict review process, let's take our old friend, the TLP decision service, and let's review that a little bit. So this is a process flow that actually walks through an insurance rating challenge that we have. And somewhere in the process, we're going to have an activity. We call it determine pricing tier risk score. It's typically a very good decision service area because let's look at the textual interpretation of the TLP challenge. Let's review it like this. TLP is an insurance company that rates its insurance applicants on 3 major categories. We know those categories to be financial stability, property risk, and coverage liability. These are all 3 sub-decisions. All of 3 roll up into the final decision of that particular service, and that is final pricing tier. If we look at this from a modeling perspective, This is DMN notation, a standard for decision management. And we can see that the three subdecisions, financial stability, property risk, determined property risk, and determined coverage liability, all three roll up into the final decision for TLP, which is determine the pricing tier. So it gives you some kind of a graphical view of the three things being subdecisions all rolling up into the final decision. In this view, you can also see that each one of these subdecisions has a box corresponding to the knowledge component, and that's really the rule representation. So let's take a look at first the financial stability knowledge and see what we can't view there. When we talk about financial stability, we're really talking about certain pieces of applicant information that influence how financially stable that particular applicant is. And in this case, we can see that there's three attributes that influence financial stability: the number of years in business, number of bankruptcies, and the years at current address, all of which are knowledge which influence whether an applicant's financial stability is poor, average, or excellent. Now let's take a look at the next piece of knowledge. It's all about property risk and how do we determine property risk. Here again, we've got some premise attributes, in this case type of construction, the prior losses, the age of the property, and property value, all of which influence the property's risk score. And here we can see that it's a low, medium, or high risk score. Next, the last piece of subdecisioning that's done is where we determine the coverage liability. And again, two premises ultimately determine what the coverage liability is. The coverage liability is high, medium, or low, and it's influenced by the coverage type and the risk type. Now the final decision, which is actually setting of the pricing tier, is actually done by looking at the three prior subdecisions, the financial stability, coverage liability, and property risk, all three of which then influence whether the pricing tier is an A, a B, a C, a refer, or a reject. I just want to point out that in some cases, information you get from your domain experts may not supply a value for pricing tier, and that's just an opportunity for investigation. I would go out and ask my domain experts, what do you expect in this case? I literally wanted to leave that blank so I could talk that. Now that we understand the actual business challenge, let's actually describe a couple of changes for release and then work through those changes to understand how we can identify conflicts. But for this section, let's actually go through the release definition. For release number 1, the changes that are wanting to be made have been communicated by Bob. Now, Bob's the underwriter, and he can communicate to Dave, who is the release manager, in a whole host of different ways, right? He can call him on the phone, he can send him an email, perhaps they've got a specific change request form, whatever the case. The essence of Bob's change is something like this. He'd like to change our TLP business decision so that all of the outcomes for coverage liability, that is the coverage liability subdecision, that currently result in a med result are changed to a medium. He commented that the underwriters in his organization identify this as kind of a shortcut name, and they really would appreciate it if the knowledge were represented in the full name, which is a medium risk perhaps, or a medium value instead of med. So that's the change that he would like. Attributally, he wants to make that change from med to medium. And he points out that if the product of this change causes anything else to be changed, say in the pricing tier area, go ahead and make that change as well. So since we're asking for the attribute, in some cases output, to be changed from med to medium, that will also be used in other decisions in TLP. So go ahead and change that. And then he also commented the timing of the change. He wanted this as soon as possible. Now let's go to release 2, which is Sally, a colleague of Bob, and she has another change. What she's saying is that she would like to change the same TLP business decision so the third rule in the pricing tier table that produces a B today, she wants to have it return a D because they've got a new classification for pricing tier. And so I've shown a little picture of what Sally gave to me, and she wants to change just this output field from a B to a D. And again, she wants those changes as soon as possible. Here we have our two releases, our two major change activities, and we're going to actually take the next step. This slide now denotes a fast forward slide. I've actually taken those two change requests, I have implemented them in ODM, and I've actually applied the changes to the rules that have been asked to change. And what we're going to do now is we're going to focus on the fact that these two releases that we've just created have rule conflicts, and we want to review what those conflicts are, and we want to understand how we're going to move forward with each of those conflicts. So in order to resolve conflicts in ODM, it's really part of merging those two releases and seeing what's in conflict. So today, that cannot be done in the Business Console, although the Business Console can actually make the edits to the rules when we go about resolving it from a merging or conflict resolution standpoint. We do that in the Enterprise Console. And let me just note, in the future, we fully expect this to be available in the Business Console, but because the Enterprise and Business Console are kind of in a transition period, today we have to do the merge process in the Enterprise Console. So we log into the Enterprise Console, we go to the home screen, and we select the radio button where it identifies that we work on a governed decision service. We highlight the fact that it's TLP, and we provide a focus on Tom's Release 1. So one part of the change process is going to be pointing to Tom's Release 1, and then we go to the project section, and it asks us what branches do we want to merge, and we select the branch that's associated with Sally's Release 2 changes. And then we hit the Next button. And what this is going to do is it's going to cause the two releases to be compared, and up on the screen you're going to see a difference manager. Select that bidirectional radio button, and then you're going to see what I show on this next screen. So this is the difference manager, and I've just highlighted it up on the screen here. You've selected bidirectional because you want to be able to know what in the first release is conflicting with the second and vice versa. And you want to have the ability at this point to use either release as a master release and then combine changes from the opposite release into that. So let's take a look at this just a little bit further. We can see from the difference manager that there's two interesting rule sets or decision tables that apply. On the very top, we see one that talks about coverage liability rules, and it has been modified as part of change activity 1 or release 1. This is Tom's release, and he modified this particular decision table. He also modified the pricing tier table because of the requirements that he had. But that's where the conflict comes in, because Sally had a change request that also modified the pricing tier table, and it's highlighting the fact that there are conflicts, that there are attributes in Tom's release that do not agree with the attribute values in Sally's release, and it's going to point those out to us. So what we need to do to view that is to come down here to the area highlighted in red, because this is the one in conflict, and we're going to select this icon here, and it will show us a little more about what those conflicts are. So here is the difference viewer, and I'm actually showing it to you in two steps because it has a slide bar that shows the entire decision table. So here we've got change activity 1 or Tom's release on the left-hand side, and we've got Sally's release on the right-hand side. And we can see that Tom in the coverage liability table has a value medium, right? Because that was his actual change. He changed everything from med to medium. But because Sally started off at the initial state, hers still was defined as med, and she did not receive those updates for medium. This is exactly what we expect. And then down a little bit further, if we were to go a little bit further to the right on this particular table, we're going to see things like Tom's Rule 3 still has a value of B because he did not make any changes to the pricing tier attribute where Sally did. Sally changed her pricing tier attribute to be a value of D, and so you can see that these two conflict, and that's why they're highlighted in yellow. This rule conflict resolution really brings up a couple of interesting things. One, this is a rather unique case, but let me highlight the two things to consider. Thing number one is which release or change activity should we use as a master? In other words, if we're going to be combining information from both of these rather than going in both directions, neither of these have been released to the rule execution server environment, so it might be easier just to use one of them and apply changes from the other release to that one and then release just that. My answer to that, or my theory behind that, is take a look at both releases and determine which one has the largest number of attributable changes. If release 2 changed just a few things and release 1 had a whole bunch of changes, you might want to consider using rule 1 as the master and make the changes from rule 2 populated in release 1 and then move forward with release 1 as the combination of the two. Now the second item is, what rules do we push from Sally's change activity number 2 or release 2 to Tom's release 1 in order to get all of Sally's information over to Tom's so that we can move forward with Tom as the master release. This is one of those unique situations because Sally just changed the pricing tier attribute and her coverage liability attribute was still left the way it was defined originally. And Tom's actually made that change. And if we tell the merge tool to copy Sally's over to Tom's, then we're going to have a little bit of an overlap. That might be best seen in this next picture. Let's review the pricing tier table, and we can see that Sally's change is this D, and Tom's changes are all of these. And so, in theory, it's easier to just take Tom's and apply Sally's changes to Tom and then move forward from a deployment standpoint. Instead of actually merging all of Sally's rules over into Tom's and impact all of this information, we're going to say, okay, we understand there's a conflict. We're going to take Sally's changes and just put them into Tom's because that's the easiest way to resolve this. Now, I do want to highlight one thing. Since we're moving forward with Tom's release, because we've copied Sally's changes to Tom's, and now we're moving forward with Tom, there is another approach here, and I want to just highlight that, and then we can talk about a few other things. The thing I want to highlight is the fact that some organizations, some people, want to, before they ever do any merging or release management, they want to create a release 3, which is really going to be a combination of release 1 and release 2. They don't want to change any developer's release for the purposes of deployment. When the release manager wants to move forward, they will create a new release 3. They'll merge Tom's changes into there. They'll move forward with release 3, leaving release 1 and release 2 unchanged, right? And from a best practice perspective, that is probably the best way to go, because creating a third release to hold the value changes of release 1 and 2 is probably a good idea. And so just from a testing perspective moving forward, if we're inside of ODM and we're doing the testing for the combined package of release 1 and release 2, we can really just take Sally's Excel spreadsheet that we used in our DVS testing and apply it to Tom's new release, right? There's no reason why we can't copy over those scenarios and just put them as part of Tom's test package. That's just fine. And similarly, if we're testing outside of ODM using something like SOAP UI, we can certainly take the test suites or the test cases that were developed for Sally and testing for that new value of D and put them over into Tom's test suite and simply just change the entry point, right? Because what we've done is we've updated Tom's decision service as the new one and just simply change the entry point, because the object model is not changed, hasn't changed. It's just a matter of providing new input premise values, We have those in Sally's test case, and so we can just copy those over to Tom's. No worries. Okay, that's how we would apply all of this change and merge processing for decision services. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.